Chapter 8. Alex McKenzie. Despite only being 7 a.m., the analog dial on the enormous mercury field temperature gauge attached to Tiddly Creek's historic town hall was already nudging its way past the 30-degree centigrade mark. Even the building's magnificent bluestone exterior was becoming warm to the touch. The inside of the McKenzie family's 150-year-old heritage-listed farmhouse was already starting to feel like an oversized sauna. Its wafer-thin, weatherboard exterior and flat, corrugated iron roof offered no resistance against this late December heatwave. The house had no insulation bats, and the electric fans stood idle because the power supply had been cut off due to non-payment of the last quarter's electricity account. The McKenzies currently lacked the funds required to have it reconnected. Times were heartbreakingly tough for all of the sheep farmers who resided in the remote, rural region of Melbourne, Australia. They were experiencing their 5th year of drought, and the sheep paddocks were bone dry. Jonah McKenzie and his neighbours were now almost completely dependent on processed feed to prevent their enormous flocks of sheep from dying of starvation. And unfortunately, the price of these manufactured pellets was continually rising as demand outstripped supply. On the brink of financial ruin, Jonah had recently made the tough decision to cut his ravenous flock's daily food intake by half. It was a difficult but essential decision. It was either this or be forced to cull over 5,000 of them. You could not give sheep away in the current market because the cost of transporting even 1,000 of them from Tiddly Creek to the nearest drought-free location way exceeded their meagre $18 per head market price. Deprived of 3 meals a day, the sheep looked gaunt and expressed their displeasure at being hungry by bleating endlessly. Despite the continuing heatwave and not a drop of moisture in the air for months, Jonah still remained optimistic that the drought would soon break. He was a deeply religious man, and was certain that the God and Jesus he prayed to every morning and twice on Sundays would not allow this daily hell to continue for much longer. When the drought did finally break, he would rather emerge with 10,000 emaciated sheep than only 5,000 healthy-looking ones. It would be far less costly to refatten the existing flock than to have to replace each of the 5,000. He knew that the price of sheep would suddenly rise overnight, from the measly $18 per head to their more realistic price of over $150 per head. It was the same story of hard times and tough decisions on all 30 of the enormous sheep stations that shared the Tiddly Creek postcode. Some farmers shared Jonah's optimism and chose to go down the same path as him, while others were more pessimistic and saw no end in sight. They took a more pragmatic approach and culled thousands of their livestock. The repugnant smell of burning sheep flesh wafted in the air for days on end. The farmers of Tiddly Creek and surrounding rural communities all wore the heavy burden of this protracted drought on their weather-beaten faces. Even Jonah's powerful broad shoulders slumped forward ever so slightly, and his akubra hat looked more creased than usual. Although he could no longer afford tobacco, the thin ivory stem of his favourite pipe still hung from the left-hand corner of his mouth like a child's security blanket. Despite having slept completely naked and without a single sheet covering his long, gangly body, Jonah's son Alex still awoke in a sweat. His room had already started trapping the morning heat and was becoming rather stuffy. He always slept with his bedroom windows closed in December because any benefits gained by the cool overnight breeze were cancelled out by the severe mosquito mauling he would be subjected to. He did not wish to add mosquito bites to his mix of pimples and freckles. The incessant sound of the millions of droning blowflies outside pierced through the flimsy single-glazed window panes and just added to his mounting irritation. The blowflies were attracted by the smorgasbord of sheep droppings that scattered the paddocks surrounding this 90-hectare farmstead. They would soon make their way in, as the aroma of his mother Grace's award-winning continental breakfast started to simmer. Although money was extremely tight, Grace would not skimp on food. She would happily go without anything else in order to ensure that her family continued to have 3 hearty meals every day. Alex was not coping very well with puberty, and it took next to nothing these days to send him over the edge. He felt awkward in his skin, and the continuous outbreak of pimples on his face was affecting his self-confidence. His family's deteriorating financial circumstances added feelings of anxiety to the mix. "What's the point in taking a shower every day," he shouted at Grace, "when there are severe water restrictions? And I'll be hot and sweaty once again in 5 minutes later anyway." Grace was short, stout and homely. She wore no makeup whatsoever and never even considered cutting or dyeing her lengthy Scottish red hair. Alex and his 2 younger sisters, Ruth and Leah, rarely saw their mum's naturally flowing red hair because every morning before the sun rose, she hurriedly fashioned it into an enormous bun and then headed straight for the kitchen to start cooking the sausages, bacon and egg for her hungry brood. The bun would only be released at about 9 p.m. after she'd cleaned the pots and pans by hand, unpacked the loads of laundry, finished knitting her quota of woolen socks, beanies and jumpers to be sold by a fancy shop in the Big Smoke, and tucked all 3 kids snugly into bed. She always wore shapeless, full-length dresses that were old, dilapidated, and severely stained from years of cooking. Her only unblemished dress was the pink frilly number that she wore to church every Sunday. Whilst Jonah got excited every time she slipped it on, her kids preferred the older dresses because the delicious smells of the years of cooking had permanently permeated their fraying fibres. Grace was a very kind and understanding soul. Her personality was as warm and as wholesome as her chunky vegetable soup. Like Jonah, she was also a law-abiding, God-fearing, devout Christian. She completely ignored Alex's angry outburst and turned the stiff, rusted knob on the outdoor gas cylinder anti-clockwise to begin heating the water. Whilst she appreciated that he was in a bad mood, she was not going to allow him to go to school smelling like a farm animal. Having barely dried himself, Alex flung on his undies and then frustratingly struggled his way into the polyester school shirt and its matching cotton shorts. He had outgrown both, but felt too guilty to ask for replacements because his dad had only just managed to scrape together the $90 required to pay for his new footy gear. With no breathing space between his angry armpits and the synthetic polyester, ugly yellow sweat marks were already starting to appear on the underarms. "What a perfect way to impress Hannah," he snarled sarcastically into the full-length mirror that he had salvaged from a dumpster and crudely attached to the back of his bedroom door using thick wads of blue tack. Hannah Smith was his closest neighbour, and also his walk-to-school partner. He had a huge crush on her, but dared not ask her out on a date for fear of being rejected. He genuinely believed that she was far too intelligent and attractive to be interested in an awkward, gangly, pimple-faced boy with average grades like him. He was completely wrong, though. She went weak at the knees every time she looked into his dreamy blue eyes, and did not for one moment mistake his up-in-the-clouds personality for stupidity. She was dying for him to ask her out on a date. Alex's tall, lanky frame was perfectly designed for Aussie rules football. Despite only being 13, he was already nudging past the 6-foot mark. His gangly arms and legs were rippled with muscle. He was the town star when it came to footy. Jonah happily drove Alex the 80 kilometres each way every Saturday morning so that his son could play junior league football against the other clubs in the well-established Swoon Hill country district. He had stopped purchasing his weekly stash of Mac Baren pipe tobacco in order to finance the exorbitant cost of the petrol needed to get the 2 of them there and back each week. His beloved 1974 Holden HJ one-toner was built like a Sherman tank and was very thirsty on the petrol. Its fuel efficiency was further hampered by a severely pocked exhaust pipe that noisily scraped along the ground. Fortunately, there were only dirt roads in this neck of the woods, and it prevented the dragging exhaust pipe from creating any dangerous sparks. Like almost all of the farm utility vehicles in this area, it would never have passed a test of roadworthiness. You had to travel at least 200 kilometres towards Melbourne CBD before you encountered the first tar road, and even further to find a road safety inspector. Jonah knew that Alex would only stand a chance of being discovered by one of the roaming Australian Footy League, AFL, scouts if he played in a well-established rural footy league like the Swoon Hill one. The footy scouts would never even consider visiting Tiddly Creek, and why would they? It was way too sleepy and sheepy for their liking. The place had a total population of 97 conservative, God-fearing citizens. 300,000 bleating sheep, millions of well-fed, lethargic blowflies, and the sluggishly slow-flowing Tiddly Creek from which it derived its name. Blink your eyes, and you may miss its town centre when you drive by. The post office, milk bar, general utilities shop, and petrol station were all combined into one tiny orange-coloured brick building. Outside, a single petrol pump stood idle most of the time, and the battered tin sign that adorned the building's facade hung by its last thread. It swung like a dangerous pendulum whenever the wind blew. The only other buildings of note were the historic bluestone town hall, the beloved tin-clad pub, the quaint stained-glassed white weatherboard church, and the small sandstone cottage that had been cleverly converted to form a combined Tiddly Creek primary and high school. Were it not for the large cornerstone on the right front corner that read Tiddly Creek School, one would never have guessed that it could possibly be a school. It looked way too small to accommodate all of the town's primary and high school kids. To be fair, though, not all of the local kids attended. Some of the wealthier families sent their children to private boarding schools. Still, it was extremely cramped inside. They were planning to build a larger school, but put this on hold on account of so many families currently selling up and leaving the district. There were no restaurants, no cinemas, and the local footy field was little more than a dried-out mudpan. The pub's home-brewed beer was as bitter as sheep urine and as warm as fresh sheep doo-doo. Please excuse my crudity, but the locals describe it this way. Mind you, it has never stopped them from drinking it by the gallon. The Swoon Hill footy scouts all told Jonah that they believed Alex had the potential to one day be a superstar. He just needed to put some meat on his bones and grow out of his awkwardness. One scout described Alex's current running style as resembling that of a giraffe with a sore knee. Alex ruffled his hand through his thick mop of ginger hair as he frustratingly examined each pussy pimple on his face. It seemed that the more he squeezed them, the more they grew. Like a vindictive enemy. Had he not suffered enough by being born with red hair and freckles? Why did he also have to have pimples? He wanted to scream, "God is cruel!" but would never dare to utter such blasphemy aloud. He would be shoveling sheep doo-doo for an entire week if such profanity were to ever bypass his brain and exit his mouth. He often wished he was more like his mother. She was always optimistic about everything. Nothing seemed to dampen her spirit, not even the severe drought that threatened their livelihood. Little did he know that she cried quite a lot these days, whenever nobody was around to see or hear her. When others were around, she would run to the outdoor hills hoist and hide her teary face behind the mass of clothing that was always hanging down. It broke Grace's heart that Alex had to struggle into an undersized school uniform, that Ruth and Leah did not have any colourful hair accessories and had to tie their hair into ponytails using ugly postal service issue elastic bands, and that Jonah could no longer afford pipe tobacco. Whilst she appreciated that smoking was a filthy habit, it was Jonah's only foible and luxury in life. Grace was the glue that bound the family together. If she lost her grip, the entire family would collapse like a pack of cards. She had to show strength at all times. Later today, she would visit the Salvation Army shop in nearby Waterville and scrounge around for a larger white shirt and a grey pair of shorts that closely resembled those of Alex's current school uniform. She could easily remove the embroidered school emblem from the old uniform and sew it onto the new one. She would also see if she could find a nice Alice band or colourful scrunchie for each of her girls. Despite Jonah insisting that she not purchase him anything for his upcoming 40th birthday, she would also check the post office to see whether the parcel containing the 500 grams of Mac Baron's finest blend had arrived. It was not every day, after all, that one's husband turned 40. Alex was so caught up in his thoughts and pimple-squeezing frenzy that he completely failed to notice Grace creeping up behind him. "Stop that!" she shouted softly, and pulled his hands away from his now bleeding face. "You need those pimples. They hide your freckles." Having made her son laugh and removed some of his grumpiness in the process, she returned to the kitchen and completed the finishing touches to the hearty breakfast that she had prepared for the family. As Alex wolfed down his breakfast, his mind returned to the issue of whether Hannah Smith could ever fall for him. He wished that his parents could afford to buy him a decent pimple cream, and dreamed of dyeing his ginger hair brown, blonde, or black, anything but ginger. It was a shame that Alex had such a degrading image of himself. In reality, he was very good-looking, in a manly sort of way. He had a sharp, chiselled nose, a square chin, high cheekbones, and dreamy blue eyes that make little girls' hearts flutter. His hair was, in fact, a blonde-ginger blend and ended in curls. As mentioned earlier, Hannah thought he was gorgeous just the way he was, and was absolutely dying for him to ask her out on a date. She continually gave him obvious hints, but he was totally blind to them. On the one and only occasion that she summoned the courage to try and hold his hand whilst walking to school, he shook his hand free of the grip with the desperation of a floundering fish and apologised profusely for accidentally touching her delicate hand. She felt like screaming out, "It was me who touched you, you gorgeous numbskull!" but felt too embarrassed to do so. As if reading his mind, his youngest sister Leah suddenly sang out, "Alex and Hannah sitting in a tree, Kissing." The precocious 8-year-old got no further with the jingle because Alex placed one of his enormous hands firmly over her mouth, her face turned from joy to fear as she struggled to breathe through her snotted-up nose. By the time Jonah managed to release Alex's vice-like grip, Leah was blue in the face and crying hysterically. Jonah stroked Leah's shiny auburn hair and kissed away her tears. He then gave her an enormous bear hug. Alex could not remember when last his dad had given him a kiss or a hug. He knew that his dad loved all of his children equally, though he just had a different way of expressing his love when it came to boys. A pat on the back or a quick ruffle of the hair was all Alex ever got. He could do without the kiss, but he would have loved a hug from his old man every once in a while. As he left the house and headed towards Hannah's, he took in the aroma of the banana cake and fresh bread that his mother was cooking. They'd be ready by the time he got home. He picked Hannah up and they started the 5-kilometre walk to school. Although both of them had bicycles, Alex a rusty green chopper and Hannah a sparkling pink Malvern Star, they chose to walk, because they enjoyed each other's company so much and wanted the time together to last as long as possible. Once in class, Alex drifted into his dream world as Mr. Kearney babbled on about fractions and square roots. Numbers did not interest him in the slightest. They were cold, rigid and impersonal. He preferred studying people. He loved wondering what everyone was thinking or what it would be like to be someone else for a day. He was a budding armchair psychologist and had become an expert in reading body language. He enjoyed trying to predict what a person was about to say, though this did not help him overcome his blindness to Hannah's interest in him. He brought a completely new meaning to the saying, "Love is blind." His daydream drifted from receiving a hug from his dad to playing for his beloved Carlton Blues football club, then to playing with his sheepdog Jessie, smashing Coke bottles with his slingshot, bouncing pebbles off Tiddly Creek and kissing Hannah under the love tree. His kiss came to an abrupt end as the loud noise of Mr. Kearney's bamboo cane smashing down on his desk scared the living daylights out of him. Alex let out an effeminate yelp to the delight of his classmates. Hannah smiled at him reassuringly. Of course, he misinterpreted the smile to be one of scorn and pity. When he arrived home from school, he hurriedly scoffed down a piece of his mother's award-winning banana cake and then went outside to play fetch with Jessie. This was her favourite game and the absolute highlight of her day. The tennis ball that they had been using for the last 2 months was bald and punctured and smelt of doggy breath. Nevertheless, the fact that the ball no longer bounced and hardly even rolled failed to dampen her enthusiasm. Alex always felt guilty ending the game. Jessie would jump up at him repeatedly in an attempt to block his path and keep him from leaving. She was a bundle of frenetic energy and would have happily kept playing fetch for hours on end. Unfortunately, he was in a bit of a rush today and could only spare her a paltry half hour. This was because he had arranged to meet his mates Johnny and Justin at their special meeting place at 3:30 p.m. It was already close on 3:15 p.m. when he finally set off. He sprinted past the sheep paddocks and crossed the main dirt road. He then zigzagged his way through the evenly spaced plantation of eucalyptus trees and finally arrived at the extremely dense wall of tea tree scrub. He then followed the winding path that snaked its way around the base of the 60-metre high hill that stood out like a giant bump against its totally flat surrounds. Although the hill was not that high, it was extremely wide. To do a full circle around the base required you to cover a distance of over 1 kilometre. As soon as Alex reached the other side of the hill's base, he heard the gentle trickling sound of the slow-flowing freshwater creek. He removed the dead twigs and branches that concealed their secret path through the dense tea trees and down to the creek's stony bed. 16 slippery steps later, he had arrived at their secret spot. It was only a few minutes after 3:30 p.m. He'd made excellent time. The water looked fairly still today, and the sky was as blue as can be. It was a perfect day for one of their fiercely contested pebble bouncing competitions. The record of 6 consecutive bounces from one throw could well be under threat today. Johnny claimed to have once achieved 7 bounces. However, the record only counted if the other 2 were there to see it. It had to be official. Johnny and Justin had arrived a few minutes earlier and had already managed to salvage the best of the pebbles. The most desirable pebbles were the ones with the pancake flat surfaces, which fitted nicely between your thumb and your first finger. Both of their buckets were almost filled to the brim with prime examples. "Greedy buggers!" shouted Alex, as he scoured the ground for any potential humdingers that may have been overlooked. "We left you all the crappy ones," laughed Justin. "That's okay," responded Alex. "I have a stronger throwing arm than both of your girly throwing arms combined. I could even make a brick bounce 7 times if I wanted to." This statement was so ridiculous and far-fetched that they all started laughing. Despite perfect conditions, none managed to get to that elusive 7th bounce. Alex and Justin both achieved a respectable 6 bounces, though. After about an hour, Johnny and Justin decided to call it quits. Alex stayed on for a short while longer. His competitive spirit compelled him to keep trying. He got so caught up in this challenge that he completely lost track of time. As he swatted a blowfly off his nose with his left hand, he caught sight of his watch and freaked out. It was already 4:54 p.m. He was due home at 5 p.m. sharp, and the sprint home would take at least 10 minutes. The only option was to take a shortcut over the hill. This would involve tackling a steep incline followed by a steep decline, whilst trampling through thick vegetation and numerous jagged rocks. By the time he reached the top, his face glistened with sweat and he was totally puffed. He had almost twisted his ankle when his right foot became awkwardly wedged between 2 rocks. That would have been an utter disaster because the area was totally isolated. As he hurriedly made his way down the steep decline, he lost his footing on a slippery rock and went sliding downwards uncontrollably on his backside. When he finally surfaced, his eyes were greeted by the most beautiful cave. It had remained totally camouflaged for all these years by the thick indigenous scrub that grew only metres from its entrance. The entrance to the cave was also partially blocked by huge peppermint plants. Their amazing aroma filled the air. Who knows for how long this cave had remained hidden? Perhaps hundreds of years, possibly even thousands of years. His imagination swam wildly. Oh, how he longed to take a quick peek inside. But there was no time now. It would have to wait until tomorrow. Little did he know just how worthwhile that wait would be.